Introduction. Purpose of identity rebuilding. Most people don't realize they've lost their identity until they're already living someone else's life. You wake up one day and notice you're saying yes when you mean no. You're performing for approval you never wanted. You're exhausted from holding a shape that isn't yours. And the worst part? You can't remember when it started. This isn't a book about confidence. Confidence is what people chase when they've already lost themselves. This is about something deeper, building an identity so solid that pressure doesn't crack it, criticism doesn't shake it, and other people's expectations don't rewrite it. Identity is not your job title. It's not your relationship status. It's not what you post online or how people describe you at parties. Identity is the internal reference system that tells you who you are when no one's watching. It's the core that stays consistent when everything around you changes. Most people never build one. They inherit beliefs from their parents, adopt behaviors to fit in, and spend decades performing roles they never consciously chose. Then they wonder why they feel hollow, why success doesn't satisfy them, why they can't make decisions without checking with 10 other people first. You can't build a life that matters if you don't know who you are. And you can't know who you are if you've spent years becoming whoever others needed you to be. Here's what this book will not do. It won't tell you to journal your feelings, repeat affirmations in the mirror, or wait for a breakthrough moment. Those things might feel good temporarily, but they don't rebuild identity. They're comfort tools, not construction tools. What this book will do is show you how to identify where you gave your power away, how to reclaim it through non-negotiables, and how to build an inner authority that doesn't collapse under pressure. You'll learn how self-respect precedes confidence, how detachment creates strength, and how predictability to yourself is the foundation of everything else. Each chapter is built around real-life scenarios: the coworker who tests your boundaries, the relationship where you've lost yourself, the decision you keep avoiding because you're afraid of judgment. You'll get exact scripts for what to say and what not to say. You'll get exercises that build identity through action, not theory. This process isn't comfortable. Rebuilding identity means facing the parts of yourself you've ignored. It means admitting where you've been weak, where you've compromised, where you've lied to yourself to avoid conflict. But discomfort is the price of alignment, and alignment is the only thing that creates lasting peace. The people who need this most are the ones who look fine on the outside. They're functional, they're responsible. But inside, they feel like they're performing a role, not living a life. They make decisions based on what others expect, not what they actually want. They've built a life that's impressive to everyone except themselves. If that's you, this is where it changes. Identity isn't something you find, it's something you build. And you build it through decisions, boundaries, and consistency when it's hard. You build it by choosing alignment over approval, clarity over comfort, and integrity over image. By the end of this book, you won't be a different person. You'll be the person you were before the world convinced you to be someone else. You'll have a framework for making decisions without second-guessing yourself. You'll know how to stay grounded when people try to pull you off center. And you'll understand that the strongest thing you can do is become predictable to yourself. This is not about becoming unshakable because nothing bothers you. It's about becoming unshakable because you know exactly who you are and you're no longer willing to negotiate that for temporary peace. Let's begin. Chapter 1. Why most people lose their identity without noticing. There's a man named David who spent 15 years building a career in finance. He was good at it, made partner at 38. Everyone told him he was successful. But when his wife asked him if he actually liked his job, he froze. He couldn't answer. Not because the answer was complicated, but because he'd never asked himself the question. He'd chosen finance because his father respected it. He stayed because his colleagues expected it. He performed because his identity had become inseparable from the role. Somewhere along the way, David stopped being a person who worked in finance and became finance itself. When the industry shifted and his firm downsized, he didn't just lose a job, he lost himself. This is how identity erosion happens. Not in one dramatic moment, but in 1,000 small concessions you don't notice until the damage is done. Most people lose their identity the same way they lose their health, gradually through decisions that seem harmless at the time. You agree to something that conflicts with your values because it's easier than explaining yourself. You suppress what you really think because you don't want to cause tension. You perform a version of yourself that gets rewarded, and slowly that performance becomes your default. The mechanism is simple. Every time you act in a way that contradicts who you actually are, you create internal distance. Your actions say one thing, your inner self knows another. That gap is where identity dies. Here's what makes it dangerous. The loss feels normal. You don't wake up one day and realize you've disappeared. You wake up tired, irritable, vaguely resentful of people who haven't done anything wrong. You feel like you're going through the motions, but you can't pinpoint why. Some people describe it as numbness. Others call it burnout. But what they're actually experiencing is the psychological cost of living as someone they're not. Let's talk about the 3 ways people lose their identity without noticing. The first is through role absorption. You take on a role, employee, parent, partner, leader, and that role starts to define you. At first, it's just what you do. Then it becomes who you are. You stop having opinions outside the role. You stop making decisions that don't serve the role. Your entire sense of worth becomes tied to how well you perform it. When the role is threatened or removed, you collapse, because you never built an identity outside of it. Sarah was a mother of 3 who spent 12 years organizing her entire life around her children. Every decision was filtered through what was best for them. She didn't resent it at first, but when her youngest started high school and needed her less, she felt lost. She had no hobbies, no goals that were hers, no sense of who she was when she wasn't needed. Role absorption isn't about caring too much. It's about disappearing into the role so completely that you forget you exist outside of it. The second way people lose their identity is through approval addiction. You learn early that certain behaviors get rewarded. Being agreeable gets you liked. Being competent gets you promoted. Being low maintenance gets you called easy to work with. So you optimize for approval. You say yes when you want to say no. You laugh at jokes that aren't funny. You hide opinions that might create conflict. You perform agreeableness because it's easier than dealing with disappointment or rejection. The problem is that approval is external. It requires constant validation. You can never relax because you're always managing how others perceive you. And the more you chase it, the less connected you feel to yourself. Michael was the guy everyone liked at work. He never caused problems, never pushed back, never said what he really thought. He believed this made him a team player. What it actually made him was invisible. When a leadership position opened up, they didn't consider him. Not because he wasn't capable, but because no one knew who he actually was. He'd spent so much time being agreeable that he had no distinct presence. Approval addiction doesn't make you likable. It makes you forgettable. The third way identity gets lost is through conflict avoidance. You learn that disagreement creates discomfort, so you start managing other people's emotions instead of standing in your own truth. You soften your boundaries to keep the peace. You apologize for things that aren't your fault. You tolerate behavior that violates your standards because confrontation feels worse than compromise. Over time, you stop knowing where you end and other people begin. You become so focused on not upsetting anyone that you lose track of what you actually believe. Jessica had a friend who constantly borrowed money and never paid it back. It bothered her. But she didn't say anything because she didn't want to seem petty. Then the friend started canceling plans last minute, then showing up late without apology. Each time Jessica swallowed her frustration, she told herself it wasn't worth the confrontation. But here's what actually happened. Every time she ignored a boundary violation, she taught herself that her standards didn't matter, that keeping the friendship was more important than keeping her self-respect. By the time she finally spoke up, she'd already lost herself in the relationship. Conflict avoidance doesn't preserve relationships. It erodes the person trying to hold them together. Now let's talk about why this happens in the first place. Humans are wired for belonging. When you're young, belonging is survival. You learn quickly what gets you accepted and what gets you rejected. You adapt. You perform. You become what your environment rewards. That's not the problem. The problem is when you never stop performing. When you carry those childhood adaptations into adulthood and keep optimizing for acceptance instead of alignment. The moment you start living for external validation, you begin the process of identity loss. Because external validation is unstable. What people reward today, they criticize tomorrow. What makes you accepted in one group makes you rejected in another. You can't build a stable identity on shifting ground. Most people don't recognize this is happening because the loss is subtle. You're still functional, still responsible, still showing up. But internally you feel disconnected, like you're watching your life happen instead of living it. Here's the test. When was the last time you made a decision based solely on what you wanted, without considering how it would be perceived? When was the last time you said no without justifying, explaining, or softening it? When was the last time you felt certain about who you are, not who you're supposed to be? If you can't answer those questions easily, you've already started losing yourself. The good news is that identity can be rebuilt. But rebuilding requires something most people avoid. Honest confrontation with how much of your life is performance and how much is real. You can't reclaim your identity by thinking about it. You reclaim it by making different choices, by setting boundaries you've been avoiding, by saying what you actually think instead of what's safe, by walking away from roles, relationships, and environments that require you to be someone you're not. This isn't about rebellion, it's about alignment. It's about closing the gap between who you are and how you live. David eventually left finance, not because he failed, but because he finally admitted it was never his path. It took 2 years of discomfort and a lot of difficult conversations, but when I talked to him recently, he said something that stuck with me. I'd rather rebuild from scratch than keep pretending I'm someone I'm not. That's the choice. Keep performing and stay lost, or start rebuilding and find yourself again. Most people choose performance because it's familiar, but familiarity isn't the same as alignment. And no amount of external success will fill the gap created by internal disconnection. If you've been feeling hollow, resentful, or exhausted for reasons you can't explain, this is why. You haven't lost motivation, you've lost yourself. And the only way forward is to stop pretending you haven't. Chapter 2: Identity versus Approval. Where you gave your power away. There's a woman named Rachel who couldn't understand why she felt anxious every time her phone buzzed. She had a good job, solid relationships, no major crisis. But every notification triggered a low-level panic. What did they want? What did they think? Did she say the wrong thing? When we dug deeper, the pattern became clear. Rachel had spent her entire adult life optimizing for other people's comfort. She responded to messages immediately, even when she was exhausted. She agreed to plans she didn't want to attend. She shaped her opinions based on who was in the room. Her entire nervous system was wired to the question, am I making them happy? She thought this made her considerate. What it actually made her was controlled. This is the core conflict most people never resolve: identity versus approval. You can't have both. One requires you to know who you are and live accordingly. The other requires you to become whoever the situation demands. Most people choose approval without realizing they're making a choice. Then they wonder why they feel empty. Here's the truth. Every time you prioritize someone else's comfort over your own truth, you give away a piece of your power. Do it enough times and you forget you ever had power to begin with. Let's be clear about what approval actually is. It's not love, it's not respect, it's a transaction. You perform a certain way and in return people don't reject you. The problem is that the terms of the transaction keep changing. What made you accepted yesterday might make you criticized today. You're constantly adjusting, constantly performing, constantly scanning for signs that you've stepped out of line. This is exhausting, and it's by design. Because as long as you're focused on managing other people's perceptions, you're not focused on building your own foundation. The mechanism works like this. You have a boundary. Someone crosses it. You feel the discomfort but don't say anything because you don't want to create tension. They cross it again. You stay quiet again. Eventually, the boundary disappears. Not because it wasn't real, but because you taught yourself that keeping the peace is more important than keeping your integrity. Now let's talk about the places where people give their power away without noticing. The first is in conversations. You have an opinion. Someone challenges it. Instead of standing in what you believe, you soften it. You add qualifiers. I could be wrong, but... Or I'm not an expert, but I think. You dilute your own position before anyone else can. Why? Because you're more afraid of being wrong than you are of being dishonest. You'd rather blend in than stand out, so you perform agreement even when you disagree. You nod along to ideas you don't believe. You laugh at jokes that aren't funny. You become a mirror reflecting back whatever keeps you safe. Marcus worked in corporate strategy. He was smart, capable. But in every meeting he'd watch which way the senior leaders were leaning before he spoke. If they liked an idea, he'd support it. If they were skeptical, he'd raise concerns. He thought this made him politically savvy. What it actually made him was invisible. No one trusted his opinion because no one knew if it was actually his. When you give away your voice to avoid conflict, you don't preserve relationships, you erase yourself from them. The second place people surrender power is in relationships. You meet someone. There's attraction, connection, possibility. Then you start adjusting. You downplay the parts of yourself that might be too much. You emphasize the parts that get positive responses. You become who they need you to be instead of who you actually are. At first, it feels like compromise. But compromise is mutual. This is one-sided accommodation. You're doing all the bending. Elena dated a man who didn't like it when she spent time with her friends. He never said it directly. He just got distant afterward. Cold. So she started declining invitations. She told herself it was temporary. That once the relationship was more secure, she'd go back to her normal life. But the relationship never felt secure, because she'd already established the pattern. His comfort mattered more than her needs. When the relationship ended, she realized she'd lost 2 years and most of her friendships. Not because he demanded it, because she volunteered it. She gave away her power, hoping it would buy her love. It didn't. It bought her resentment and a version of herself she didn't recognize. Here's the pattern. When you shrink yourself to fit into someone else's life, you don't become more lovable. You become less yourself. And eventually you resent the person you bent yourself for, even though they never asked you to. The third place power gets surrendered is in decision-making. You face a choice. Instead of asking what you actually want, you ask what other people will think. Will they approve? Will they understand? Will they judge you? You poll your friends, you seek validation, you look for permission. Not because you don't know what you want, but because you're afraid to want it without consensus. James wanted to leave his law career and start a woodworking business. He'd been thinking about it for 3 years. But every time he mentioned it, people responded with concern. That's a big risk. Are you sure? What about stability? So he stayed. Not because he changed his mind, because he couldn't handle the disapproval. 10 years later, he's still practicing law, still miserable, still thinking about the life he didn't choose because he needed other people to agree with it first. This is what giving away power looks like, knowing what you want but waiting for permission to want it. Now let's talk about why this pattern is so hard to break. Approval feels like safety. When you were a child, approval from adults literally meant survival. You learned to read the room, to adjust your behavior, to become what was needed. That's not weakness, that's adaptive intelligence. The problem is when you never outgrow it. When you carry that childhood strategy into adulthood and keep optimizing for acceptance instead of authenticity. Adult life doesn't require you to please everyone. But your nervous system doesn't know that. It still treats disapproval like a threat. So you keep performing, keep adjusting, keep giving away pieces of yourself to avoid the discomfort of being disliked. Here's what you need to understand. Disapproval isn't dangerous, it's just uncomfortable, and discomfort is the price of having a distinct identity. If everyone agrees with you, you're not living from your center, you're performing from theirs. So how do you stop giving your power away? First, you name it. You start noticing the moments when you soften your truth to avoid tension. When you agree, when you don't. When you say yes, when you mean no. You don't judge it, you just see it clearly. Second, you practice small acts of reclamation. You state your opinion without softening it. You say no without over-explaining. You stop checking in with 10 people before making a decision. These feel small, but they're not. Each one is a deposit into your identity account. Third, you tolerate the discomfort of disapproval. Someone doesn't like your decision, they're disappointed, they push back. And you stay steady, you don't argue, you don't justify, you don't collapse. You just hold your ground. This is the skill most people never develop, the ability to remain solid when others withdraw approval. Here's the script. I understand this isn't what you wanted, but it's the right decision for me. That's it. No justification, no apology, no negotiation. Most people can't do this because they're addicted to harmony. They'll sacrifice their truth to avoid 30 seconds of tension. But that 30 seconds of tension is the price of keeping your power. And it's a price worth paying. Rachel eventually learned this. She started saying no without explaining why. She stopped responding to messages immediately. She let people be disappointed. At first, it felt like she was being difficult. Then it felt like she was being honest. Then it felt like she was being herself. Some people didn't like it. A few friendships faded, but the ones that stayed became deeper. Because they were built on who she actually was, not who she was performing to be. Here's the truth most people avoid. You will lose relationships when you stop performing. Some people are only connected to the version of you that serves them. When you stop being that version, they leave. This isn't a loss, it's clarity. The right people don't need you to shrink. They don't need you to perform, they want you solid, clear, and honest. And you can't be those things if you're still negotiating your identity for approval. You have a choice. Keep giving your power away in small, forgettable moments, or start reclaiming it through boundaries, honesty, and the willingness to be misunderstood. The second option is uncomfortable, but it's the only one that leads to a life that's actually yours. Stop waiting for permission to be who you are. Stop softening your truth to keep the peace. Stop performing for people who will never be satisfied. Your power isn't something you find. It's something you stop giving away. Chapter 3. The psychological cost of living out of alignment. There's a man named Tom who developed chronic back pain in his early 40s. He saw doctors, tried physical therapy, adjusted his workstation. Nothing helped. Then one session, his therapist asked him a question that had nothing to do with his back. "What are you carrying that isn't yours?" Tom went silent. Then he started talking about his job, how he hated it but stayed because it paid well, how he'd promised his father he'd take over the family business even though he never wanted to, how every morning felt like putting on a costume. The therapist didn't diagnose his back. She diagnosed his life. He was living out of alignment and his body was keeping score. This is what most people don't understand. Misalignment isn't just uncomfortable. It's physiologically expensive. Your body doesn't differentiate between a physical threat and a psychological one. When you live in constant contradiction to who you are, your nervous system treats it as danger. And danger triggers stress. Chronic stress breaks you down. Living out of alignment means your actions don't match your values. You say you care about health but eat garbage. You say family matters but work 70 hours a week. You say integrity is non-negotiable but compromise it whenever it's inconvenient. The gap between what you claim and how you live creates internal dissonance. And dissonance has a cost. Let's talk about what that cost actually looks like. The first symptom is exhaustion that rest doesn't fix. You sleep 8 hours but wake up drained. You take a vacation but come back just as tired. This isn't physical fatigue. It's the exhaustion of maintaining a false self. Every conversation requires performance. Every decision requires calculation. You're spending energy pretending instead of living, and that drain is constant. When you're aligned, action flows. When you're misaligned, everything is friction. You're pushing against yourself all day. That's why people who live out of alignment describe feeling heavy, like they're dragging weight that isn't visible. The second symptom is irritability without obvious cause. Small things set you off. Someone chews too loudly. Traffic frustrates you more than it should. A coworker asks a simple question and you want to snap. You're not actually angry at these things. You're angry at the life you're living. But because you can't admit that, the anger leaks out sideways. Misalignment creates internal pressure. That pressure needs release. Some people explode at others. Some implode into depression. Either way, the emotion isn't about the trigger. It's about the accumulated cost of living a life that doesn't fit. Jennifer was a lawyer who hated litigation. She wanted to write, but writing didn't pay the bills, so she kept litigating. Over time, she became sharp with her assistant, impatient with her husband. She'd snap over small things and then feel guilty afterward. She wasn't a bad person, she was a misaligned person. Her irritability was the symptom, her career was the cause. The third symptom is decision paralysis. You can't choose because no option feels right. Not because the options are bad, but because you don't know who you are anymore. You've spent so long being what others needed that you've lost touch with what you actually want. So every decision becomes agonizing. You second guess. You poll others. You delay. Not because you lack information, but because you lack an internal compass. Alignment gives you clarity. Misalignment gives you confusion. The fourth symptom is emotional numbness. You stop feeling much of anything. Not happiness, not sadness, just a flat gray existence. People ask how you are and you say fine because you don't know how else to describe it. This isn't depression in the clinical sense, it's disconnection. You've severed the link between your authentic self and your daily life. And when that link breaks, emotion fades. Brandon worked in tech sales, made good money, looked successful. But when his daughter asked if he liked his job, he realized he didn't feel anything about it. Not excitement, not dread, just nothing. He'd optimized his life for income and lost connection to meaning. The numbness was his psyche's way of protecting him from the pain of recognizing how far he'd drifted. The fifth symptom is physical breakdown: migraines, digestive issues, insomnia, chronic pain. Your body is not separate from your psychology. When you live in misalignment, your nervous system stays activated. Fight or flight becomes your baseline. That chronic activation wears down your immune system, disrupts your hormones, and creates inflammation. Doctors will treat the symptoms, but unless you address the misalignment, the symptoms return. Because the root cause isn't medical, it's existential. Now let's talk about why people stay misaligned even when it's destroying them. The first reason is sunk cost. You've already invested years into this path, this relationship, this career, this identity. Walking away feels like admitting those years were wasted, so you stay, hoping it will eventually feel right. It won't. Time invested doesn't make a wrong path right, it just makes the cost of staying higher. The second reason is fear of judgment. If you change direction, people will ask why. They'll question your choices. Some will say you're being impulsive or irresponsible. You'll have to explain yourself repeatedly. And that feels harder than just staying the course. But here's the truth. Other people's opinions are not a valid reason to live a life that's killing you. The third reason is identity attachment. You've built an identity around the misaligned path. You're the responsible one who stays in the stable job. You're the loyal one who never leaves. You're the dedicated one who sacrifices for others. Changing the path means changing the identity, and that feels like death. Because in a way, it is. The false self has to die for the real self to emerge. But here's what most people miss. Staying misaligned doesn't preserve you. It erodes you, slowly, quietly, until one day you wake up and don't recognize the person in the mirror. So how do you measure alignment? Ask yourself, do my daily actions reflect my stated values? If you say health matters but you don't move your body, you're misaligned. If you say relationships matter but you don't protect time for them, you're misaligned. If you say integrity matters but you compromise it regularly, you're misaligned. Alignment isn't perfection. It's consistency between what you claim and how you live. Here's another measure. Do I feel energized or drained by my daily life? Aligned action might be challenging, but it doesn't deplete you. Misaligned action drains you even when it's easy. If you're constantly exhausted despite adequate rest, that's your body telling you something is wrong. Not with your schedule, with your choices. One more measure. Can I explain my decisions without defensiveness? When you're aligned, your choices make sense to you. You can state them calmly. When you're misaligned, you get defensive, you over-explain, you justify. Because somewhere inside, you know you're not living your truth. The cost of misalignment compounds over time. In your 20s, you might power through. In your 30s, it starts wearing on you. By your 40s, it's causing breakdowns, physical, emotional, relational. The body keeps score, and eventually the bill comes due. Tom eventually left the family business. His father didn't understand. Some relatives called him selfish. But within 6 months, his back pain disappeared. Not because of treatment, because the weight he'd been carrying was psychological, not physical. Once he stopped living someone else's life, his body stopped breaking down. Here's the hard truth. No one can tell you if you're living in alignment. Only you know. And most people spend years lying to themselves about it because the truth is too uncomfortable to face. But discomfort now or destruction later. Those are the options. If you're experiencing chronic exhaustion, irritability, numbness, indecision, or physical symptoms that don't respond to treatment, stop looking for external solutions. Start looking at alignment. Ask yourself honestly, am I living a life that's actually mine? Or am I living a life I think I'm supposed to live? The gap between those two questions is where the cost accumulates. You can't think your way into alignment. You have to choose your way into it, one decision at a time, one boundary at a time, one honest conversation at a time. It won't be comfortable, but it will be honest. And honesty is the only foundation strong enough to build a real life on. Stop carrying what isn't yours. Stop performing a role that's crushing you. Stop pretending the cost isn't real. Your body is talking. The question is whether you're ready to listen. Chapter 4. Rebuilding Identity Through Non-Negotiables. There's a woman named Claire who couldn't figure out why she felt so unstable. She had flexibility in her schedule, freedom in her choices, but no sense of ground beneath her feet. Every decision felt arbitrary. Every boundary felt optional. She described it as living in quicksand, nothing solid to stand on. Then she started working with a coach who asked her one question. What are your non-negotiables? Claire went blank. She didn't have any. She'd spent so long being adaptable, accommodating, and flexible that she'd never established anything she wouldn't compromise. And without non-negotiables, she had no foundation, no center, no identity. This is the rebuild, not through affirmations or self-help rituals, but through the deliberate construction of non-negotiables. These are the standards, boundaries, and principles you will not violate regardless of pressure, convenience, or consequence. They're not aspirations. They're lines you've drawn that define who you are. Most people confuse preferences with non-negotiables. A preference is something you'd like. A non-negotiable is something you require. Preferences bend. Non-negotiables don't. Here's the difference. I prefer to exercise versus I move my body every day, no exceptions. One is a wish. The other is a standard, and standards are what build identity. Let's talk about why non-negotiables matter. Without them, you're reactive. Your behavior changes based on who you're with, what's convenient, or what others expect. You become a shapeshifter, adjusting to every environment. That might feel like adaptability, but it's actually instability, because you have no core that remains constant. Non-negotiables create that core. They're the things about you that don't change regardless of circumstance. They tell you who you are when everything else is in flux. And more importantly, they tell others who you are, not through words, but through consistent action. When you have clear non-negotiables, decision-making becomes simpler. You don't agonize over every choice because many choices eliminate themselves. If something violates a non-negotiable, it's not an option. This isn't rigidity, it's clarity. Now let's talk about how to identify your non-negotiables. Start with integrity. What behaviors are you not willing to compromise on, even when it's costly? For some people, it's honesty. They won't lie, even to avoid conflict. For others, it's loyalty. They won't abandon people when things get hard. For others, it's respect. They won't tolerate being demeaned regardless of who's doing it. These aren't moral judgments. They're personal standards. You're not saying everyone should hold them. You're saying you do. Marcus decided his non-negotiable was punctuality. Not because being late is evil, but because for him, respecting other people's time was foundational. He built his schedule around it. When friends were consistently late, he addressed it. When it didn't change, he stopped making plans with them. Not out of anger, but out of alignment. His time mattered, and he required others to treat it that way. Some people thought he was rigid. He didn't care. Because rigidity around your non-negotiables isn't a weakness. It's a statement of identity. Next, look at your daily habits. What behaviors do you need to maintain to respect yourself? This isn't about productivity hacks. It's about what you require to feel like yourself. For some, it's movement. Their body needs to move every day or they feel disconnected. For others, it's solitude. They need time alone to process or they lose clarity. For others, it's creativity. They need to create something regularly or they feel hollow. These aren't luxuries, they're requirements. And when you treat them as optional, you erode your foundation. Claire realized her non-negotiable was morning silence. She needed 30 minutes before engaging with anyone or anything. No phone, no conversation, just silence. When she protected that time, her entire day felt different. When she sacrificed it to accommodate others, she felt off-center all day. So she stopped sacrificing it. She woke up earlier when necessary. She communicated the boundary clearly, and she stopped apologizing for needing it. Here's the script. I need this time to function well. It's non-negotiable for me. No justification, no over-explaining, just a clear statement of fact. Third, examine your relationships. What do you require from the people you allow close to you? Not what you hope for, what you require. Some people require honesty. If someone lies to them, the relationship is over, not negotiable. Others require effort. If someone consistently shows low investment, they exit. Others require respect. The moment disrespect appears, they create distance. This doesn't make you demanding, it makes you clear, and clarity is kind. It tells people exactly what's required to be in your life. They can choose to meet it or not, but they can't say they didn't know. Jennifer had a friend who only called when she needed something, never to check in, never to offer support, just to extract. Jennifer kept accepting it because she didn't want to seem petty. But every interaction left her feeling used. When she established her non-negotiable, relationships must be reciprocal, the dynamic became clear. She stopped being available for one-sided extraction. The friend got offended and pulled away. Jennifer felt relief, not loss, because she'd stopped violating her own standard to maintain a relationship that wasn't real. Now let's address the fear that stops most people from establishing non-negotiables. The fear of being difficult. You've been conditioned to believe that having firm standards makes you inflexible, unreasonable, or hard to deal with. This is a lie designed to keep you compliant. People who benefit from your flexibility will always frame your boundaries as problems. But here's the reality. People respect clarity. They might not like your boundaries, but they respect them. What they don't respect is inconsistency. When your standards shift based on pressure, people learn they can negotiate with you. And once you're negotiable, you're controllable. Non-negotiables make you uncontrollable. Not in an aggressive way, in a grounded way. You're not hostile. You're just clear. And that clarity removes the need for drama, explanation, or defense. Here's how to implement non-negotiables in real life. First, identify 3, not 10. 3. Too many dilutes focus. Start with the 3 standards that, if violated, make you feel like you've betrayed yourself. Second, communicate them clearly. You don't announce them to the world, but when they're relevant, you state them simply. I don't do business with people who don't honor agreements. I don't maintain relationships where there's no mutual respect. I don't compromise my health for work deadlines. Third, enforce them without apology. Someone crosses the line. You address it once, clearly. If it happens again, you act. You don't threaten. You don't negotiate. You just follow through. This is where most people fail. They set boundaries but don't enforce them, and unenforced boundaries aren't boundaries, they're suggestions. David had a non-negotiable about honesty in his marriage. When he discovered his wife had hidden a financial decision, he didn't explode. He stated the boundary clearly. Honesty is non-negotiable for me. If it happens again, I'm out. She tested it once more. He left. Not out of anger, but out of integrity. He'd stated his standard. She violated it. He followed through. Some people thought he was harsh. He wasn't. He was aligned. And alignment requires that your actions match your words. Here's what happens when you live by non-negotiables. Your life simplifies. You stop wasting energy on situations that violate your standards. You stop tolerating relationships that drain you. You stop making decisions that create internal conflict. This doesn't mean life becomes easy. It means it becomes coherent. Your actions align with your values. And that alignment creates a stability that external circumstances can't shake. Non-negotiables also serve as a filtering system. When opportunities arise, you run them through your standards. Does this require me to compromise a non-negotiable? If yes, it's not an opportunity, it's a test. And the correct answer is no. Some people will call this rigid. Let them. Because what they're actually uncomfortable with is that you can't be moved, and people who are used to moving you will always have a problem with that. Here's the truth most people avoid. You teach people how to treat you through what you tolerate. If you tolerate disrespect, you'll get more disrespect. If you tolerate inconsistency, you'll get more inconsistency. If you tolerate violations of your standards, those violations become the norm. Non-negotiables stop that pattern. They establish a clear baseline, and anyone who can't meet that baseline doesn't belong in your life. This isn't about being perfect. You'll still make mistakes, you'll still have moments where you compromise. But when you do, you'll feel it immediately. Because you've built an internal alarm system that goes off when you violate your own standards. That alarm is your identity reasserting itself. Listen to it. Claire rebuilt her life around 5 non-negotiables: morning silence, daily movement, honest communication, reciprocal relationships. Work that aligned with her values. Within 6 months, her life looked completely different. She'd changed jobs, ended 2 friendships, started saying no without guilt. Some people didn't understand. She didn't need them to. Because for the first time in her adult life, she felt solid. Not because everything was perfect, but because she was living according to standards she'd set for herself. And those standards gave her something no amount of flexibility ever could: a foundation. You can't build an identity on preferences. Preferences shift, standards hold. Non-negotiables aren't restrictive, they're liberating. Because once you know what you won't compromise, you know who you are. And knowing who you are is the only real power you'll ever have. Chapter 5: How Self-Respect is Built and Why Confidence Follows Later. There's a man named Kevin who hired me because he wanted to be more confident. He had a good job, solid relationships, no obvious problems. But he felt like an imposter. Like he was one mistake away from being exposed as a fraud. He wanted confidence techniques, scripts for networking, ways to project authority. I told him confidence wasn't his problem, self-respect was. He didn't understand the difference. Most people don't. They think confidence is the foundation. It's not. Self-respect is. Confidence is what you feel when you trust yourself. Self-respect is what makes you trustworthy to yourself. One is an emotion. The other is a condition you create through repeated action. You can't think your way into self-respect. You can't affirm it into existence. You build it the same way you build muscle, through consistent effort that creates adaptation. Every time you keep a promise to yourself, you deposit into your self-respect account. Every time you break one, you withdraw. Most people are overdrawn. They've made and broken so many promises to themselves that they no longer believe their own words. They say they'll start tomorrow, they don't. They say they'll set a boundary, they cave. They say this time will be different, it's not. Over time, the gap between what they say and what they do becomes so wide that they stop trusting themselves entirely. That's not a confidence problem, that's a self-respect crisis. Let's talk about how self-respect is actually built. It starts with small, private promises. Not grand declarations, not public commitments, private agreements between you and yourself that no one else knows about. These are the ones that matter most because there's no external accountability. No one will know if you break them except you. And that's exactly why they build self-respect. You're not performing for an audience. You're proving something to yourself. The promise doesn't have to be big. It can be as simple as, I will drink water before coffee. I will make my bed every morning. I will not check my phone for the first hour after waking. The specific promise matters less than whether you keep it. When you keep a promise to yourself, something shifts internally. You start to believe that your word means something, that when you say you'll do something, you will. That internal trust is the beginning of self-respect. Kevin started with one promise: no phone in the bedroom. That's it. For 2 weeks, he charged his phone in another room. It was uncomfortable. He wanted to check messages. He wanted the convenience. But he held the line, and something interesting happened. He started sleeping better. But more importantly, he started trusting himself more. Because he'd said he would do something, and he did it. That trust became leverage for the next promise, then the next. Within 3 months, he'd rebuilt enough self-respect that confidence stopped being something he had to perform. It became something he felt naturally, because he knew he could rely on himself. Now let's talk about why most people struggle with this. The first reason is they make promises based on motivation, not capacity. They feel inspired, so they commit to something unrealistic. They'll work out 6 days a week. They'll wake up at 5 a.m. They'll quit sugar entirely. The promise is too big. They fail. They feel like failures. And they withdraw from the self-respect account. Self-respect isn't built through heroic promises. It's built through sustainable ones. Promises you can keep even on your worst days. That's the standard. If you can't do something when you're tired, stressed, and unmotivated, don't promise it. Start smaller. Because keeping a small promise builds more self-respect than breaking a big one. The second reason people fail is they don't enforce consequences. They break a promise and nothing happens. They just move on. Maybe they feel guilty for a moment, but there's no real cost. So the behavior repeats. Self-respect requires consequence, not punishment. Consequence. If you say you're going to do something and you don't, you need a system that holds you accountable. For some people, that's financial. They put money on the line. For others, it's relational. They tell someone who will check in. For others, it's internal. They have a rule. If I break a promise to myself, I don't get to do the thing I was going to do instead. The consequence doesn't have to be harsh. It just has to be real. Maria struggled with this. She'd promise herself she'd work on her business before scrolling social media. Then she'd scroll first, promising she'd work after. She never did. There was no consequence, so the pattern continued. She implemented a simple rule. If I scroll before working, I don't scroll at all that day. The first time she broke her promise, she deleted the apps from her phone for 24 hours. It was uncomfortable. But it worked. Because now there was a cost to breaking her word. And that cost made her take her promises seriously. The third reason people struggle is they don't track. They make promises and then forget about them. They lose track of whether they're keeping them or not. Without tracking, there's no data. And without data, you can't see the pattern. Self-respect requires visibility. You need to see clearly whether you're keeping your word or not. For some people, that's a simple checklist. For others, it's a journal. For others, it's a streak tracker. The method doesn't matter, the visibility does. When you track, you confront reality. You can't lie to yourself about whether you're following through. And that honesty is essential. Because self-respect can only be built on truth. Now let's talk about the relationship between self-respect and confidence. Confidence is downstream from self-respect. When you respect yourself, you trust your ability to handle situations. You're not worried about failure because you know you'll respond to it with integrity. You're not paralyzed by decisions because you trust yourself to deal with whatever consequences arise. That trust creates confidence, not the loud, performative kind, the quiet, unshakable kind. Kevin eventually got the promotion he wanted, Not because he learned confidence techniques, but because he rebuilt self-respect. And once his self-respect was solid, confidence became automatic. He walked into the interview knowing he could handle whatever happened. Not because he was perfect, but because he trusted himself. That's the difference. People without self-respect try to project confidence. People with self-respect don't have to. It radiates naturally from knowing they'll keep their word to themselves. Here's how to build self-respect starting today. First, identify one promise you can keep for 30 days. 1, not 5. 1. Make it small enough that you have no excuse for breaking it. So small it feels almost silly. That's the right size. Second, track it. Every day, mark whether you kept the promise. Don't skip days, don't rely on memory, write it down, make it visible. Third, enforce a consequence for breaking it. Decide in advance what happens if you fail, then follow through without negotiation. Fourth, don't add a second promise until you've kept the first one for 30 days. This is where most people fail. They get excited and stack promises before the first one is solid. Don't. One promise, 30 days. Build the foundation before you add floors. After 30 days, add a second promise. Same process. Track it. Enforce consequences. Keep it for 30 days, then add a third. Within 6 months, you'll have 6 promises you keep consistently. And those 6 promises will have rebuilt your self-respect more than any confidence seminar ever could. Here's what people get wrong. They think self-respect comes from big achievements. It doesn't. It comes from small, consistent integrity. From doing what you said you'd do when no one is watching. From keeping your word to yourself even when it's inconvenient. That consistency builds a foundation, and once the foundation is solid, everything else becomes easier. You stop second-guessing your decisions because you trust yourself to handle whatever comes. You stop seeking external validation because you have internal approval. You stop performing confidence because you have actual self-respect. The world tells you to fake it until you make it. That's backwards. You can't fake self-respect. You build it through action. And once you have it, confidence isn't something you chase. It's something you embody. Kevin described it like this. I used to walk into rooms wondering if I belonged there. Now I walk in knowing I can handle whatever happens. Not because I'm the smartest or most talented, because I trust myself. And that trust came from keeping promises no one else knew about. That's the work. Not glamorous, not fast, but real. Self-respect isn't built through grand gestures. It's built through daily integrity, through keeping your word when it's hard, through enforcing boundaries when it's uncomfortable, through following through when motivation is gone. Do that consistently, and confidence stops being something you have to manufacture. It becomes something you naturally possess. Because you've proven to yourself that you're someone worth trusting. And once you trust yourself, the opinions of others lose their power. Because the only approval that matters is the one you give yourself. And you earn that approval the same way you earn anything real. Through action, consistency, and integrity. Stop chasing confidence. Build self-respect. Keep your promises to yourself. Track your integrity. Enforce your standards. Do this daily, privately, without audience or applause. That's how you become unshakable. Not through belief, but through proof. Proof that you are who you say you are. And that proof only comes one kept promise at a time. Chapter 6. Detaching from old roles, labels, and expectations. There's a woman named Sophia who spent 32 years being the responsible one, in her family, at work, in every relationship. She was the person people called when things went wrong, the one who fixed problems, the one who carried weight without complaining. She built her entire identity around being needed. Then her father died. And in the months after, something shifted. She realized she'd spent 3 decades living a role she never chose. She wasn't naturally responsible. She'd become responsible because no one else would. And somewhere along the way, the role became her. She forgot there was a person underneath it. When she tried to step back, to let others handle their own problems, the pushback was immediate. Her family called her selfish. Her friends said she was changing. Her mother accused her of abandoning the family. Because the role she'd played for 30 years was convenient for everyone else. And when she stopped playing it, they didn't see growth. They saw betrayal. This is what detachment requires, not just releasing the role, but surviving the backlash when you do. Most people are living roles they never consciously chose. The good son who can't disappoint his parents. The loyal employee who can't set boundaries at work. The selfless partner who can't prioritize their own needs. These roles might have served you once. They kept you safe. They got you approval. But at some point, they stopped being strategies and became prisons. You can't build a real identity while you're still performing an assigned role. The role has to die first, and that death is uncomfortable, because everyone around you is invested in the version of you that serves them. Let's talk about how roles take root. They usually start in childhood. You notice what gets rewarded and what gets punished. Maybe being quiet kept you safe. Maybe being funny got you attention. Maybe being perfect earned approval. So you leaned into that behavior. You optimized for it. And over time, it became your identity. The problem is that childhood strategies don't work in adult life, but you keep performing them because they're familiar. You're 40 years old, still trying to be the perfect child. Still trying to avoid conflict at all costs. Still trying to make everyone happy. And you wonder why you feel exhausted. Old roles persist because they're reinforced externally. People expect you to show up a certain way. When you deviate, they correct you. Not maliciously. They're just protecting the version of you they know. The version that doesn't disrupt their comfort. Nathan was the peacemaker in his friend group. Anytime there was conflict, he mediated. He smoothed things over. He made sure everyone was okay. He thought this made him valuable. What it actually made him was invisible, because he was so busy managing everyone else's emotions that he never expressed his own. When he finally started saying what he actually thought, his friends were uncomfortable. They didn't know how to respond to a Nathan who had opinions, who pushed back, who didn't automatically defer. Some friendships survived, others didn't, because they weren't built on who he was. They were built on the role he played. Now let's talk about labels. Labels are different from roles, but they trap you the same way. Labels are how other people define you. The smart one, the difficult one, the quiet one, the reliable one. Once a label sticks, people treat you according to it. And if you're not careful, you start treating yourself according to it too. Labels are limiting because they reduce you to one dimension. You're not a full person, you're a characteristic. And when you deviate from that characteristic, people get confused, sometimes hostile, because you're not behaving according to their mental model of you. Lisa was labeled the funny one in her family. Every gathering she was expected to entertain, to lighten the mood, to make people laugh. It started as something she enjoyed, but by her 30s it felt like a job. She couldn't show up and just be. She had to perform. And when she tried to have a serious conversation, people dismissed it. Don't be so serious, Lisa. Where's the fun Lisa we know? She wasn't allowed to be anything other than funny. The label had become a cage. Detaching from labels requires you to act outside of them deliberately, to show up in ways that contradict the label. This feels like risk, because you're violating people's expectations. But the risk of staying trapped in a label is higher than the risk of breaking it. Here's the script. I know you see me as label, but that's not all I am. I need space to be more than that. Some people will adjust, others won't. And that tells you everything you need to know about whether they're connected to you or to their idea of you. Now let's address expectations. Expectations are invisible contracts you never agreed to but are somehow bound by. Your parents expect you to follow a certain path. Your partner expects you to show up a certain way. Your employer expects you to prioritize work above everything else, and you comply. Not because you agree, but because violating expectations feels like betrayal. But here's the truth. Other people's expectations are not your obligations. You didn't sign up for them. You don't owe your life to someone else's vision of how you should live it. The hardest expectations to break are familial, because family expectations come wrapped in love, loyalty, and guilt. Your parents sacrificed for you, so you owe them the life they want for you. Your siblings need you to stay in the role you've always played. Your extended family expects you to show up, stay quiet, and not cause disruption. Breaking these expectations feels like tearing the fabric of the relationship, and sometimes it does, but the alternative is living your entire life as a character in someone else's story. Marcus was expected to take over his father's business. It was never discussed. It was just assumed. He went to business school because that's what was expected. He worked in the business for 8 years because that's what was expected. Then one day he told his father he was leaving to teach. His father didn't speak to him for 6 months. That silence was painful. But Marcus said something that stuck with me. I'd rather lose his approval than lose myself. That's the choice. You can have their approval or your authenticity. Rarely both. Here's how to detach from roles, labels, and expectations. First, identify which ones you're carrying. Write them down. The role you play at work, the role you play in your family, the labels people use to describe you, the expectations people have of you. Get it all visible. You can't release what you don't see clearly. Second, ask yourself, did I choose this or was it assigned? Be honest. Most of what you're carrying you never chose. You inherited it. You accepted it because it was easier than refusing it. But inherited identity isn't real identity. Third, choose one role, label, or expectation to challenge. Not all of them. 1. Start small. Show up differently in one context. Say no to one expectation. Express one opinion that contradicts your label. See what happens. The pushback will come. People will be confused, disappointed, maybe even angry. Let them. Their discomfort is not your responsibility. Your alignment is. Fourth, prepare for loss. Some relationships won't survive your growth. Some people are only in your life because of the role you played. When you stop playing it, they'll leave. This isn't rejection. It's clarification. You're finding out who's connected to you versus who's connected to what you do for them. Sophia lost 3 friendships when she stopped being the person everyone leaned on. It hurt, but she also realized those friendships were built on extraction, not connection. The people who stayed were the ones who wanted to know the real her, not the useful her. Fifth, allow yourself to be undefined for a while. When you release old roles, there's a gap. You're no longer the old version, but you're not yet clear on the new version. That gap is uncomfortable. You'll feel unmoored, uncertain. But that uncertainty is necessary. You're in transition. Don't rush to fill the space with a new role. Sit in the undefined space. Let the real you emerge without forcing it. This is where most people fail. They're so uncomfortable with the gap that they grab onto a new role immediately. They go from being the responsible one to being the rebellious one, from being the perfectionist to being the cynic. They trade one cage for another. Don't. Stay in the uncertainty. Trust that clarity will come through action, not analysis. Detachment also requires you to stop defending your choices. When you change, people will demand explanations. They'll want to understand why you're not who you used to be. And if you're not careful, you'll spend all your energy justifying yourself. Don't. You don't owe anyone an explanation for growing. You don't owe anyone comfort about your evolution. The people who matter will adjust. The ones who can't aren't your people. Here's the script. I'm changing. I know that's uncomfortable for you, but I need you to respect it. That's it. No justification, no apology, just a clear boundary. The goal isn't to become someone new, it's to become yourself. Underneath the roles, labels, and expectations is a person with preferences, opinions, desires that may not match what's been projected onto you. That person has been buried. Your job is to excavate them. This isn't a fast process. You've spent years building the false self. It will take time to dismantle it. But every role you release, every label you shed, every expectation you refuse brings you closer to who you actually are. And who you actually are is more interesting, more powerful, and more alive than any role you've been playing. Sophia described the shift like this. I used to feel like a function. Now I feel like a person. That's what detachment gives you. Not freedom from responsibility, but freedom from performing responsibility to earn your right to exist. You don't have to be the responsible one, the funny one, the quiet one, the strong one. You can just be. And just being is enough. Stop carrying roles that don't fit. Stop performing to meet expectations you never agreed to. Stop shrinking into labels that reduce you. Let the old versions die. They served their purpose. Now it's time to live as yourself, not as the person others need you to be, but as the person you actually are. That person is worth knowing, and the only way to know them is to stop being everyone else. Chapter 7. Creating an Inner Reference System, Internal Authority. There's a man named Daniel who could never make a decision without polling at least 5 people. Job offer? He'd ask his parents, his friends, his mentor, his partner. Major purchase? He'd research for weeks, read reviews, ask strangers online. Even small things, where to eat, what to wear, required external input. He thought he was being thorough. What he was actually doing was outsourcing his authority. When I asked him why he couldn't just decide, he said something revealing. What if I'm wrong? That question is the prison. Because as long as you're more afraid of being wrong than of being controlled by other people's opinions, you'll never develop internal authority. And without internal authority, you'll spend your entire life waiting for permission to live. Internal authority is the ability to make decisions based on your own judgment, values, and assessment of reality, without needing external validation to feel certain. It's not about always being right. It's about trusting yourself enough to be wrong and handle the consequences. Most people never develop this. They're 40, 50, 60 years old, still checking with others before making moves, still looking for consensus, still needing approval. Not because they're incompetent, but because they were never taught to trust their own judgment. Let's talk about why internal authority matters. Without it, you're at the mercy of whoever has the strongest opinion. Your direction changes based on who you talk to last. You become a weather vane, spinning with every new input. That's not wisdom. That's instability. Internal authority creates consistency. You make decisions based on a stable set of principles, not based on who's in the room. That consistency allows you to build toward something. Without it, you're constantly starting over because your direction keeps changing. Internal authority also protects you from manipulation. People who lack it are easy to control. They're seeking certainty, and whoever offers it with enough confidence can steer them. That's why cults target people with weak internal authority. That's why manipulative partners isolate their victims from other voices. Remove external references and people without internal authority collapse. Now let's talk about how internal authority is built. It starts with learning to sit with uncertainty. Most people outsource their decisions because they can't tolerate not knowing. They need someone to tell them they're making the right choice. But certainty before action is a myth. You can't know if a decision is right until you live with the consequences. And if you wait for certainty, you'll never move. Internal authority requires accepting that you'll make decisions with incomplete information, that some of those decisions will be wrong, and that you'll handle it. Not perfectly, but adequately. That tolerance for uncertainty is the foundation. Daniel started building this by making small decisions without consulting anyone. What to eat for lunch, what route to take home, what to do on a Saturday. These seem trivial, but they're not. Each one is practice in trusting his own judgment without external validation. At first, he felt anxious. What if he chose wrong? But nothing catastrophic happened. He ate lunch. He got home. He spent his Saturday. And he learned that most decisions don't require external input. They just require action. The second component is developing a value system. Internal authority requires an internal standard to reference. If you don't know what you value, you can't make decisions aligned with those values. You're just guessing. Or worse, adopting whatever values the person you're asking holds. Your value system is your decision-making framework. It tells you what matters most. When two options conflict, your values tell you which one to choose. Without them, every decision is arbitrary. Here's how to build it. Identify the 3 to 5 principles that are non-negotiable for you. Not what you think you should value, what you actually value. These become your reference points. For some people, it's integrity. When faced with a choice, they ask, which option allows me to maintain my integrity? For others, it's growth. Which option makes me better? For others, it's family. Which option serves the people I love? The specific values don't matter. What matters is that they're yours and you've defined them clearly enough to use them. Maria realized her core value was autonomy. Once she named it, decisions became simpler. Job offer with a higher salary but less control over her schedule? Declined. Relationship that required her to check in constantly? Ended. Social obligation that felt like duty rather than choice? Refused. She wasn't being difficult. She was being aligned. The third component is learning from your own experience. Most people give more weight to other people's experiences than their own. Someone tells them something won't work and they believe it, even if their own experience suggests otherwise. That's external authority overriding internal knowledge. Internal authority requires valuing your direct experience. You try something, you observe what happens, you adjust based on what you learned, not based on what someone said should happen, but based on what actually happened. This doesn't mean ignoring advice. It means filtering advice through your own experience. Someone says you should wake up at 5 a.m. to be productive. You try it. You're exhausted and less productive. Your experience tells you it doesn't work for you. Internal authority means trusting that data over the advice. External authority says this worked for them, so it should work for you. Internal authority says this is what worked for me based on direct evidence. The fourth component is making decisions and living with them without second-guessing. Most people make a choice, then immediately start questioning it. Did I choose right? Should I have done the other thing? They replay the decision endlessly, seeking reassurance that never comes. This erodes internal authority, because you're teaching yourself that you can't be trusted to decide, that even after you choose, you need to keep checking. Internal authority requires finality. You make a decision. You commit to it. You live with it. If it turns out badly, you adjust. But you don't spend weeks agonizing over whether you should have chosen differently. You chose. That's done. Now you deal with the outcome. Here's the practice. Make a decision. Then for the next 72 hours, refuse to second-guess it. No matter what doubts arise, you don't revisit the choice. You live with it. This builds trust in your ability to commit. Nathan practiced this with a job offer. He had two options. He analyzed them, made a choice, and then refused to reconsider for 3 days. His mind wanted to. What if the other job was better? What if he made a mistake? He didn't engage with those thoughts. He'd made his decision. He honored it. By the end of 3 days, the anxiety had passed. He realized the decision itself mattered less than his ability to commit to it. That commitment is what builds authority. The fifth component is tolerating disapproval without collapsing. Internal authority means you can make a decision others disagree with and not need to defend it or change it to regain their approval. You can sit with their disappointment, their confusion, their criticism, and stay solid. This is where most people fail. They have internal clarity, but the moment someone questions them, they fold. They start justifying, explaining, seeking validation. And in doing so, they hand their authority back to the other person. Here's the script. I understand you see it differently. I've made my decision. No justification, no defense, just a statement of fact. You've decided. They don't have to agree. You're not asking for permission. Some people will push. They'll want to know why. They'll argue. They'll try to change your mind. Internal authority means you don't engage. You're not debating. You've already decided. This doesn't make you closed-minded. It makes you grounded. You listened to input. You considered it. You made a choice. Now you're standing in it. The sixth component is distinguishing between advice and noise. Not all input is valuable. Most of it is projection. People giving you advice based on their fears, their values, their experience. That doesn't make it wrong, but it doesn't make it applicable to you either. Internal authority requires discernment. You listen to input, but you filter it. Does this align with my values? Is this person speaking from experience or fear? Does their advice serve my growth or their comfort? Most people accept all input equally. They let anyone with an opinion influence them. That's why they're confused. They're trying to integrate conflicting advice from people with different agendas. Internal authority means you're selective. You listen to people who've been where you're going. You ignore people who are projecting their limitations onto you. And you trust yourself to know the difference. Here's what happens when you build internal authority. Decisions become faster. You stop needing 3 weeks and 10 opinions to choose. You assess. You decide. You move. That speed creates momentum. Relationships become clearer. People learn they can't sway you with pressure or guilt. They adjust. Some leave because they can't control you anymore. The ones who stay respect you more. Your stress decreases because you're not carrying the weight of everyone else's opinions. You made your choice based on your values. If it's wrong, you'll handle it. That acceptance removes the anxiety, and most importantly, you start feeling like yourself, because you're not living according to a committee. You're living according to your own judgment. And that alignment creates a stability nothing external can provide. Daniel eventually stopped polling people. He started making decisions based on his own assessment. Some decisions worked out, some didn't. But he learned something critical. He could handle both outcomes. The fear of being wrong had kept him paralyzed. Once he realized he could survive his mistakes, the fear lost its power. Internal authority isn't about never asking for input. It's about knowing the input is advisory, not mandatory. You can listen to 10 people and still choose differently than all of them, because you're the one living with the consequences. And that gives you the final say. Stop outsourcing your authority. Stop waiting for consensus. Stop needing validation before you move. Build your value system. Learn from your experience. Make decisions and honor them. Tolerate disapproval. Filter input. Trust yourself. That's how you become someone who doesn't need permission to live. Someone who moves with clarity, not confusion. Someone who answers to themselves first. Internal authority isn't arrogance, it's responsibility. You're taking full ownership of your choices, not blaming others when things go wrong, not crediting others when things go right. Just owning your decisions and living with them. That ownership is what creates freedom, real freedom. Not the absence of consequences, but the presence of self-trust. And once you have that, no one can take it from you. Chapter 8. Identity under pressure. Staying grounded when tested. There's a woman named Angela who rebuilt her entire identity. She set boundaries at work. She ended relationships that drained her. She established non-negotiables. For 6 months, she felt solid, clear. Then her mother got sick, and within 2 weeks, every boundary she'd built collapsed. She was back to saying yes when she meant no. Back to managing everyone's emotions, back to performing the role of the responsible daughter who sacrifices everything. She called me frustrated. I thought I'd changed, but the moment pressure hit, I became exactly who I was before. This is the test most people fail. You can rebuild your identity in calm conditions, but identity isn't real until it survives pressure. Until you can stay grounded when everything around you is pulling you off center. That's when you find out if you've actually changed or if you've just been practicing in easy mode. Pressure reveals truth. It shows you where your foundation is solid and where it's still weak. Most people avoid pressure because it's uncomfortable, but pressure is the only thing that proves whether your identity is real or just theoretical. Let's talk about what pressure actually does. Pressure activates your survival patterns, the behaviors you learned early to keep yourself safe. For some people, that's people-pleasing. Under pressure, they immediately revert to making everyone else comfortable. For others, it's withdrawal. They shut down and disappear. For others, it's control. They try to micromanage everything to feel secure. These patterns are deeply wired. They protected you once, but they don't serve you now. And under pressure, they resurface automatically unless you've done the work to interrupt them. Angela's pattern was self-abandonment. When things got hard, she'd sacrifice herself to stabilize everyone else. She knew this intellectually. But knowing doesn't stop the pattern. Only conscious interruption does. The first step to staying grounded under pressure is recognizing when you're being tested. Pressure doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it's subtle. A guilt trip from a family member. A passive-aggressive comment from a colleague. An expectation you're supposed to meet without question. These moments are tests. Will you hold your boundary or collapse it? Will you stay aligned with your values or revert to old patterns? Most people don't recognize the test until they've already failed it. Here's how to recognize it in real time. Notice when you feel the urge to abandon yourself. When you're about to say yes, but every part of you wants to say no. When you're about to apologize for something that isn't your fault. When you're about to explain yourself to someone who doesn't deserve an explanation. That urge is the signal. You're being tested. The second step is pausing. Under pressure, your instinct is to react immediately, to fix, to smooth things over, to comply. That reaction is what keeps you trapped in old patterns. The pause is where your power lives. 3 seconds, 3 breaths. Long enough to create space between the pressure and your response. Long enough to ask, what does my aligned self do here? Not what's easiest, not what keeps the peace. What's aligned? Marcus learned this when his boss tried to pressure him into working weekends. Old Marcus would have said yes immediately. Rebuilt Marcus paused. He didn't react. He said, "Let me think about that and get back to you." That pause gave him time to access his internal authority instead of his people-pleasing pattern. When he responded, he said no. Clearly, without apology. His boss wasn't happy. But Marcus held the line, and that moment, choosing alignment over approval under pressure, strengthened his identity more than 6 months of calm ever could. The third step is anchoring to your non-negotiables. Under pressure, everything feels urgent. Everything feels like an emergency, and emergencies make people compromise. But most things that feel urgent aren't. They're just uncomfortable. Your non-negotiables are the anchors. When pressure hits, you don't ask what's comfortable. You ask, does this violate a non-negotiable? If yes, the answer is no. No explanation. No negotiation, just no. This sounds simple. It's not. Because pressure comes with guilt, obligation, and emotional manipulation. People will tell you you're being selfish, that you're letting them down, that if you really cared, you'd make an exception. That's the test. Will you hold your standard or collapse it to relieve the discomfort? Jennifer's non-negotiable was not tolerating disrespect. She'd rebuilt her identity around that standard. Then her sister, going through a divorce, started taking her anger out on Jennifer, snapping at her, blaming her, making cruel comments. Old Jennifer would have absorbed it. She would have told herself her sister was going through a hard time, that she needed to be understanding. But rebuilt Jennifer recognized the test. Her sister's pain didn't entitle her to disrespect. She addressed it once. I understand you're hurting, but I won't tolerate being spoken to this way. Her sister tested the boundary twice more. Jennifer created distance, not out of anger, out of alignment. Her non-negotiable was real, which meant it applied even when it was hard. The fourth step is managing your nervous system. Pressure triggers physiological responses. Your heart rate increases, your breathing gets shallow. Your body goes into fight, flight, or freeze. And when your nervous system is dysregulated, you can't access your higher-level thinking. You revert to survival patterns. Staying grounded under pressure requires regulating your body. Deep breathing, grounding techniques, physical movement. Whatever brings your nervous system back to baseline, you can't make aligned decisions from a panicked state. Here's a simple protocol. When you feel pressure rising, take 6 deep breaths. Inhale for 4 counts. Hold for 4. Exhale for 6. This activates your parasympathetic nervous system and takes you out of fight or flight. It sounds basic. It works. The fifth step is remembering that other people's discomfort is not your emergency. This is the belief that keeps most people trapped. Someone is upset, so you must fix it. Someone is disappointed, so you must change your decision. Someone is uncomfortable with your boundary, so you must remove it. No. Other people's emotional responses are theirs to manage. You can care about their discomfort without being responsible for it. You can have empathy without abandoning yourself. This distinction is critical. Caring means you acknowledge their feelings. Responsibility means you change your behavior to manage their feelings. One is compassion. The other is codependence. Daniel's father was upset when Daniel moved across the country. He wanted Daniel close. He made his disappointment clear. Old Daniel would have felt guilty and stayed. Rebuilt Daniel felt compassion but didn't change his decision. He said, I understand you're disappointed. I'm still going. His father's discomfort wasn't Daniel's emergency, and Daniel staying wouldn't actually solve his father's real issue, which was learning to manage his own emotions instead of expecting his son to organize his life around them. The sixth step is using pressure as information. When you hold a boundary and people push back, you're learning something valuable. You're learning who respects your autonomy and who only values you when you're compliant. Some people will adjust. They'll respect your boundary even if they don't like it. Those are your people. Others will escalate. They'll guilt you, punish you, withdraw affection. Those people were never connected to you. They were connected to what you did for them. Pressure clarifies relationships. It shows you which connections are real and which are transactional. That clarity is painful, but it's necessary. You can't build an authentic life on transactional relationships. Angela eventually learned this. When she held boundaries with her family during her mother's illness, some family members attacked her, called her selfish, said she was abandoning them. Others supported her. They understood she could help without destroying herself. The first group revealed themselves. They didn't want Angela, they wanted a function. And when she stopped performing that function, they turned hostile. That hurt, but it also freed her, because now she knew who she was actually connected to. Now let's talk about the specific scenarios where identity gets tested most. The first is family crisis. When something goes wrong in your family, the pull to revert is strongest, because family has the deepest hooks. They know how to activate your guilt. They know your weak points. And they'll use them, often unconsciously, to get you back into your old role. Staying grounded requires remembering that helping doesn't mean self-abandonment. You can support family without sacrificing your boundaries. You can care without carrying everything. The second scenario is relationship conflict. When your partner is upset, the urge to collapse your boundaries to restore harmony is intense. But relationships built on one person's self-abandonment don't survive long-term. They breed resentment. Staying grounded means holding your position even when your partner is disappointed. Not meanly, not defensively, just clearly. I understand you're upset. I'm not changing my decision. The third scenario is professional pressure. When your job, your income, or your reputation feels threatened, the temptation to compromise your values is strong, to work the hours that violate your boundaries, to tolerate treatment that crosses your standards, to stay silent when you should speak. Staying grounded requires remembering that no job is worth losing yourself, and any job that requires you to violate your core values isn't sustainable anyway. The fourth scenario is social pressure. When your friend group, your community, or your social circle expects you to show up a certain way. Going against that expectation feels like social suicide, but staying in a community that requires you to perform isn't belonging, it's captivity. Staying grounded means being willing to lose social approval to maintain integrity, and trusting that the right people will appear when you're being real. Here's what most people get wrong about pressure. They think the goal is to avoid it. It's not. Pressure is inevitable. The goal is to develop the capacity to stay grounded when it comes. That capacity is built through practice. Every time you hold a boundary under pressure, you strengthen your foundation. Every time you choose alignment over comfort, you prove to yourself that you can handle discomfort. And that proof is what makes your identity unshakable. Angela eventually rebuilt her boundaries with her family. It took months. There were setbacks. But each time pressure came, she got better at recognizing the test and staying solid. She learned that guilt was just an emotion, not a command. That disappointment from others was survivable, that she could care deeply and still maintain her standards. By the time her mother recovered, Angela had proven something to herself. She could stay grounded even when everything around her was chaos. That proof changed everything. Because now she knew her identity wasn't conditional. It was solid. Pressure doesn't break you. It reveals whether you're actually built or just performing. And the only way to know is to stay in the fire long enough to find out. Stop avoiding tests. Stop collapsing under pressure. Stop abandoning yourself the moment things get hard. Recognize the test. Pause. Anchor to your non-negotiables. Regulate your nervous system. Remember that others' discomfort isn't your emergency. Use pressure as information. That's how identity becomes real. Not in theory, in practice, under fire, when everything's pulling you off center and you stay grounded anyway. That's when you know you've actually changed, and that's when no one can take it from you. Chapter 9. Becoming predictable to yourself, the core of stability. There's a man named Victor who described his life as constant whiplash. One week he'd be disciplined, focused, on track. The next week he'd collapse into old patterns. He'd set a boundary, then violate it himself 3 days later. He'd make a commitment, then abandon it when it got uncomfortable. He wanted to trust himself, but he couldn't, because he had no idea which version of himself would show up on any given day. He wasn't lazy. He wasn't uncommitted. He was unpredictable to himself. And that unpredictability was destroying any foundation he tried to build. This is the problem most people don't recognize. You can have values, you can have boundaries, you can have goals. But if your behavior doesn't match them consistently, you don't have identity. You have intentions. And intentions without consistency are just noise. Becoming predictable to yourself is the final piece of building unshakable identity. It's the ability to know how you'll show up regardless of circumstance, mood, or pressure. Not because you're rigid, but because you've established standards you won't violate. And that consistency creates a stability nothing external can provide. Let's talk about why predictability matters. Without it, you can't build anything. Every structure requires a foundation, and foundations require consistency. If the ground shifts constantly, nothing you build will stand. The same is true for identity. If your behavior changes based on how you feel, who you're with, or what's convenient, you have no stable self, just a collection of reactions. Predictability also builds self-trust. When you know you'll follow through on what you say, you start believing your own words. When you know you'll hold your boundaries even when it's hard, you stop second-guessing them. That trust is what creates confidence. Real confidence, not the performance of it. Most people don't trust themselves because they have mountains of evidence that they can't be trusted. They've said they'd start tomorrow 1,000 times and didn't. They've set boundaries and immediately violated them. They've made promises to themselves and broken them without consequence. Over time, that teaches them they're unreliable, and people who don't trust themselves can't build anything lasting. Now let's talk about what predictability actually looks like. It's not about being the same person in every situation. It's about being the same person to yourself. Your core standards don't shift based on who's in the room. Your values don't change based on convenience. Your boundaries don't disappear when they're tested. Predictability means if you say you don't tolerate disrespect, you don't tolerate it on Monday, Wednesday, or Saturday. Not from your boss, your partner, or your parent. The standard holds. If you say you protect your mornings for focused work, you protect them. Not just when it's easy, but when someone asks for a meeting, when a friend wants to talk, when your inbox is full. The boundary holds. If you say you keep your commitments, you keep them. Even when motivation fades. Even when it's uncomfortable. Even when no one would know if you didn't. The promise holds. That's predictability. And it's built through repetition, through making the aligned choice so many times that it becomes automatic. Until staying in integrity requires less effort than violating it. Victor started building this with one standard. He would not check his phone for the first hour after waking. That's it. One boundary. But he enforced it without exception. First week it was hard. He wanted to check messages, he wanted to scroll. But he held the line. Second week, slightly easier. By the fourth week, it was automatic. And something shifted. He realized he could trust himself to hold a standard. That trust gave him leverage for the next boundary. Then the next. Within 6 months, he'd built 5 standards he never violated. And those 5 standards gave him something he'd never had before. Predictability. He knew how he'd show up. He knew what he'd tolerate and what he wouldn't. He knew that when he made a commitment, he'd keep it. That predictability became his foundation. And once the foundation was solid, everything else became easier. Now let's talk about the obstacles that prevent predictability. The first is mood-dependent behavior. Most people's standards shift based on how they feel. When they're energized, they're disciplined. When they're tired, they're permissive. When they're happy, they're generous. When they're stressed, they're irritable. Their mood drives their behavior, which means their behavior is constantly changing. Predictability requires decoupling behavior from mood. You don't act based on how you feel. You act based on your standards. You feel tired, but you still keep your commitment. You feel stressed, but you still hold your boundary. You feel unmotivated, but you still follow through. This doesn't mean ignoring your emotions. It means not letting them dictate your actions. Emotions are information. They're not instructions. The second obstacle is situation-dependent standards. Most people's boundaries change based on context. They'll enforce a standard with acquaintances but violate it with family. They'll hold firm at work but collapse at home. They have different versions of themselves for different environments. That's not adaptability. That's inconsistency. And inconsistency erodes identity. Predictability means your standards travel with you. The person you are at work is the same person you are at home. The boundaries you hold with strangers, you hold with family. The values you claim in public, you live in private. There's one version of you, and that version is consistent. The third obstacle is convenience-based decision-making. Most people make choices based on what's easiest in the moment. The path of least resistance, the option that avoids discomfort. That strategy might reduce short-term friction, but it creates long-term chaos. Because you're constantly making different choices based on what's convenient, and over time, that creates a pattern of unpredictability. Predictability requires principle-based decision-making. You don't ask what's easiest. You ask what's aligned, not what avoids discomfort, but what maintains integrity. And you choose that option even when it's harder. Rachel struggled with this. She'd commit to things, then back out when something more appealing came up. She thought she was being flexible. What she was actually doing was teaching herself that her commitments were optional, that her word meant nothing. She started implementing a rule. If I commit to something, I follow through unless there's an emergency. Not inconvenience, emergency. That rule forced her to be more careful about what she committed to, and it forced her to honor the commitments she made. Within months, people started trusting her more. But more importantly, she started trusting herself. Now let's talk about how to build predictability systematically. First, identify your core operating principles. These are the 3 to 5 rules you will not violate under any circumstance. Not guidelines. Rules, non-negotiable standards that define how you operate. For some people, it's honesty. They will not lie, period. For others, it's follow through. If they say they'll do something, they do it. For others, it's respect. They will not tolerate being disrespected or disrespect others. Write these down. Make them visible. These are your constitution. Every decision you make gets filtered through them. Second, create identity-based habits. These are daily behaviors that reinforce who you are, not what you want to become, who you are right now. If you're someone who values health, you move your body daily, not when you feel like it. Daily. If you're someone who values growth, you read or learn something every day. If you're someone who values relationships, you connect with people you care about regularly. These habits aren't aspirational. They're declarations. You're not trying to become someone who values health. You are someone who values health, and people who value health move their bodies, so you do. Every day, without negotiation. Third, enforce consequences for violations. When you break a standard, there needs to be a cost. Not punishment, consequence. Something that makes the violation less appealing than maintaining the standard. Some people use financial consequences. They put money on the line. Others use social consequences. They tell someone who will hold them accountable. Others use identity consequences. If I break this standard, I remove a privilege I've been giving myself. The consequence doesn't have to be severe. It just has to be real. Because without consequence, standards are suggestions, and suggestions don't build predictability. Fourth, track your consistency. You need visibility into whether you're actually predictable or just telling yourself you are. Keep a simple log. Did I hold my standards today? Yes or no? Track it for 30 days. Look at the pattern. If you're 90% consistent, you're building predictability. If you're 50% consistent, you're still inconsistent. The data tells you where you actually are, not where you think you are. Fifth, eliminate excuses in advance. Most unpredictability comes from justifying violations. I was tired. It was a special circumstance. Just this once. These excuses feel reasonable in the moment, but they're lies you tell yourself to avoid discomfort. Predictability requires ruthless honesty. Either the standard holds or it doesn't. There's no just this once. Because just this once is how standards die. You make an exception, then another, then the exception becomes the rule, and you're back to being unpredictable. Here's the practice. When you're tempted to make an exception, ask yourself, would I accept this excuse from someone I was holding accountable? If the answer is no, then it's not a valid excuse. Hold yourself to the same standard you'd hold others to. Now let's talk about what changes when you become predictable to yourself. First, decision-making becomes effortless. You don't agonize over choices because most choices are already decided by your standards. Does this align with my principles? Yes or no? If no, it's not an option. That clarity eliminates decision fatigue. Second, relationships stabilize. People know who you are because you show them consistently. They know what you'll tolerate and what you won't. They know that when you commit, you follow through. That consistency makes you reliable, and reliability builds trust. Third, self-doubt decreases. When you're predictable to yourself, you stop second-guessing. You know how you'll show up. You know you'll handle whatever comes. That knowledge creates a quiet confidence that doesn't need external validation. Fourth, external pressure loses its impact. When people try to guilt you, manipulate you, or push you off your standards, it doesn't work, because you're more committed to your consistency than to their comfort. That commitment makes you nearly impossible to move. Fifth, you start feeling like yourself, maybe for the first time in years, because you're not code switching, you're not performing different versions, you're just being the same person in every context. And that coherence creates a peace nothing external can provide. Victor described it like this: I used to feel like I was constantly improvising. Now I feel like I know my lines. I know who I am and how I show up. And that knowing makes everything else simpler. That's what predictability creates, not rigidity, simplicity, clarity, stability. Stop changing your standards based on convenience. Stop violating your own rules. Stop being a different person depending on who's watching. Establish your core principles. Build identity-based habits. Enforce consequences for violations. Track your consistency. Eliminate excuses. Become someone you can predict, someone you can count on, someone whose word means something, especially to yourself. That's the foundation of unshakable identity, not philosophy, not theory. Predictable, consistent action that proves to you day after day that you are exactly who you say you are. And once you know that, nothing can shake you, because your identity isn't dependent on circumstances, it's dependent on consistency. And consistency is the one thing you have complete control over. Become predictable to yourself. That's where stability lives. That's where trust lives. That's where freedom lives. And that's where your real life begins. Chapter 10. Living from identity, not emotion or circumstance. There's a woman named Diane who spent most of her life reacting. Good day at work? She'd feel great and make ambitious plans. Bad interaction with her partner? She'd spiral and question everything. Unexpected expense? She'd panic and abandon her goals. She was functional, but she lived on an emotional roller coaster. Her decisions, her mood, her entire sense of self shifted based on what was happening around her. Then one day she asked a question that changed everything. Who am I when nothing is going right? She couldn't answer, because she'd never built an identity separate from her circumstances. She was only confident when things were going well, only calm when life was stable, only clear when there was no pressure. Remove the favorable conditions and she had no idea who she was. This is the difference between living from identity and living from circumstance. Living from circumstance means you're only solid when conditions are favorable. Living from identity means you're solid regardless of conditions. One is conditional stability. The other is actual stability. Most people live from circumstance without realizing it. They think they're grounded, but they've only been tested in good weather. The moment storms come, and they always do, the foundation reveals itself. And for most people, there is no foundation, just a collection of responses to whatever's happening around them. Living from identity means you've built something internal that doesn't depend on external conditions, a core that remains constant when everything else is changing, a self that doesn't evaporate when circumstances shift. Let's talk about what that actually looks like. Living from identity means your behavior is driven by your values, not your emotions. You feel angry, but you don't act from anger. You feel afraid, but you don't make decisions from fear. You feel disappointed, but you don't collapse into victimhood. You feel the emotions, but you don't let them drive. This isn't suppression, it's sovereignty. You're in charge, not your emotions, not your circumstances, you. Michael learned this after a business failure. For years, his identity was tied to success. When he succeeded, he felt valuable. When he failed, he felt worthless. The business collapse forced him to ask, who am I when I'm not succeeding? At first, he had no answer. But slowly, he built one. He established values that weren't performance-based: integrity, growth, service. These didn't depend on outcomes. They were about how he showed up, not what he achieved. And once those values became his center, his sense of self stabilized. He stopped riding the emotional roller coaster of success and failure. He became someone who operated from a stable core regardless of results. Living from identity also means your worth isn't negotiable based on circumstances. You don't feel valuable when things are going well and worthless when they're not. Your worth is inherent. It doesn't fluctuate. And because it doesn't fluctuate, circumstances lose their power to destabilize you. Most people outsource their worth to external validation: promotions, relationships, achievements, approval. And as long as those things are present, they feel okay. But the moment one is threatened, they collapse. Because their worth was never internal. It was borrowed from circumstances. Living from identity means reclaiming that worth. Deciding it's not up for debate, not dependent on performance, approval, or achievement. Just inherent. You have worth because you exist. Period. This isn't arrogance, it's foundation, and without it, you'll always be at the mercy of whatever's happening around you. Now let's talk about the specific shifts required to live from identity instead of emotion or circumstance. The first shift is from reactive to intentional. Reactive people respond to whatever shows up. Intentional people create the conditions they want to live in. They don't wait for circumstances to improve. They decide who they're going to be and act accordingly. Someone disrespects you. Reactive response: match their energy. Get defensive. Engage in conflict. Intentional response: hold your boundary. State what's acceptable. Remove yourself if necessary. You're not reacting to their behavior. You're acting from your standard. You face a setback. Reactive response: panic. Question everything. Abandon the plan. Intentional response: assess what happened, adjust strategy, keep moving. You're not controlled by the setback. You're responding from your values. Reactive living keeps you unstable. Intentional living creates stability. Because you're not being tossed around by circumstances, you're navigating them from a fixed point. The second shift is from mood-dependent to principle-dependent. Most people's behavior changes based on how they feel. Good mood: they're productive, kind, generous. Bad mood: they're irritable, avoidant, self-destructive. Their mood drives their actions, which means their actions are unpredictable. Living from identity means your principles drive your actions, not your mood. You don't feel like working out, but you value health, so you do it anyway. You don't feel like being patient, but you value respect, so you are anyway. You don't feel like following through, but you value integrity, so you do anyway. This is hard, because it requires acting against how you feel. But that's exactly what builds identity. Every time you act from principle instead of mood, you strengthen your core. Every time you let mood dictate behavior, you weaken it. The third shift is from externally referenced to internally referenced. Externally referenced people check the environment before deciding how to be. What will people think? What's expected? What's safe? Their behavior is determined by external cues. Internally referenced people check their values before deciding how to be. What's aligned? What's true? What maintains my integrity? Their behavior is determined by internal standards. One creates instability because the external environment is constantly changing. The other creates stability because internal standards remain constant. Sarah struggled with this at family gatherings. She'd walk in with a clear sense of herself, and within an hour, she'd be performing whatever role kept the peace. She'd laugh at jokes that weren't funny. She'd agree with opinions she didn't hold. She'd suppress what she actually thought. By the end of the night, she felt hollow. She started practicing internal referencing. Before family events, she'd remind herself of her values: honesty, authenticity, respect. Then during the gathering, when she felt the pull to perform, she'd check in. What's aligned? Sometimes that meant stating an unpopular opinion. Sometimes it meant not laughing at an inappropriate joke. Sometimes it meant leaving early. Some family members didn't like it. But Sarah stopped abandoning herself to maintain harmony. She decided her integrity mattered more than their comfort, and that decision, to reference herself instead of them, changed everything. The fourth shift is from outcome-focused to process-focused. Outcome-focused people tie their identity to results. If they succeed, they're valuable. If they fail, they're not. That creates massive instability because outcomes aren't fully controllable. Process-focused people tie their identity to how they show up. Did I act with integrity? Did I give my best effort? Did I stay aligned with my values? Those things are controllable, and because they're controllable, they create stability. You can lose the game and still respect yourself if you played with integrity. You can fail the project and still trust yourself if you gave genuine effort. You can experience rejection and still feel solid if you showed up authentically. Outcomes matter, but they don't define you. Process defines you. And when you shift your focus to process, circumstances lose their power to destabilize your sense of self. Now let's talk about how to practice living from identity. First, establish your identity statement. This is a clear, written declaration of who you are, not who you want to be, who you are right now based on your values and standards. I am someone who keeps my word. I am someone who does not tolerate disrespect. I am someone who prioritizes health. I am someone who acts from integrity, not convenience. Write 3 to 5 statements. Make them specific, make them true. These become your reference points. When you face a decision, you ask, What would someone with this identity do? Then you do that. Second, create identity-based responses to common triggers. You know the situations that tend to throw you off center. The guilt trip from your mother, the passive-aggressive comment from your colleague, the unexpected expense, the rejection. For each trigger, decide in advance how your identity responds, not how your emotion responds, how your identity responds. Guilt trip from mother. I understand you're disappointed. I'm still making this decision. Passive-aggressive colleague. Acknowledge once, then disengage. No need to manage their emotion. Unexpected expense. Assess. Adjust. Move forward, no panic. Rejection. Feel it. Process it. Keep moving. Worth is not negotiable. When the trigger happens, you don't improvise. You execute the predetermined response. Over time, this becomes automatic. Your identity response becomes faster than your emotional reaction. Third, practice the gap. The gap is the space between stimulus and response. Something happens, you don't react immediately, you pause, you check in with your identity, you choose your response. That gap is where freedom lives. Without it, you're controlled by circumstances. With it, you're in charge. Start small. Someone says something that bothers you. Instead of reacting, take 3 breaths. Feel the urge to react. Don't act on it. Ask yourself, what does my identity do here? Then do that. The gap gets longer with practice. Eventually, you stop being reactive altogether. You become someone who responds from identity, not impulse. Fourth, debrief daily. At the end of each day, ask yourself, did I live from identity today, or did I live from emotion and circumstance? Where did I stay solid? Where did I collapse? No judgment, just data. This reflection builds awareness. And awareness is what allows you to course correct. You notice patterns. You see where you're strong and where you're still weak. And you adjust. Fifth, surround yourself with people who reflect your identity back to you. Not people who enable your reactive patterns. People who call you higher, who expect you to live from your values, who don't let you collapse into circumstance-based thinking. These people become mirrors. They show you who you actually are when you forget, and they hold you accountable when you start slipping. Here's what changes when you live from identity instead of emotion or circumstance. You stop being thrown by setbacks. Things go wrong. You don't spiral. You assess and adjust. Because your identity isn't tied to things going right. You stop needing perfect conditions to be yourself. You're the same person on good days and bad days, in favorable circumstances and unfavorable ones. That consistency creates a stability people can feel. You stop seeking external validation. You know who you are. You don't need others to confirm it. That independence makes you magnetic. Because people are drawn to those who aren't controlled by opinion. You start trusting yourself completely. Because you've proven you'll show up as yourself regardless of what's happening around you. That trust is unshakable. And once you have it, nothing external can take it away. Diane rebuilt her life around this principle. She decided she was someone who stayed grounded regardless of circumstances. That decision became her filter. Bad day? She stayed grounded. Financial stress? She stayed grounded. Relationship conflict? She stayed grounded. It wasn't easy. But over time, it became her default. She stopped being reactive. She stopped letting circumstances dictate her state. She became someone who lived from a stable core. And that core changed everything. Not because her circumstances improved, they didn't always, but because she stopped needing them to improve to feel solid. Stop letting emotions drive your behavior. Stop letting circumstances define your worth. Stop being one person when things are good and another person when they're not. Establish your identity. Build predetermined responses. Practice the gap. Debrief daily. Surround yourself with people who reflect your values. Live from who you are, not from what's happening around you. That's the final piece. That's what makes identity unshakable. Not because nothing can touch you, but because nothing can move you off your center. You are not your circumstances. You are not your emotions. You are the stable core beneath all of it. And once you know that, once you live from that, you become someone no one can break. Because your identity isn't out there, it's in here, and no one has access to it but you. If this audiobook has brought you clarity, strength, or peace, consider supporting the channel so more people can find this message. Please like this audio and subscribe. Your support helps this work reach those who feel overwhelmed, anxious, or unprotected, and gives them a path back to calm, confidence, and emotional freedom. Thank you for listening. Stay grounded. Stay wise. You are the anchor in every storm.